This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. This morning it's my pleasure to have back with us again Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Good morning, Charles. Welcome back.
Thank you, Gordon. Always a pleasure to be here.
It's always nice how quickly the month goes, and how different the subjects are to consider when we're going to talk than they were the month before. That's what always fascinates me with our talks. But Charles, we've talked Japanese debt, the cargo cult, the Japanese culture before, but last Friday we got a stunner of announcement from the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of Japan is going to further increase its balance sheet at a 15% annual rate from a level that was, we've talked about already 50% of GDP. Bond purchases will now total $750 billion per year, and I scaled that, Charles, to the United States. That would be equivalent to us running $3 trillion a year in America if we were to follow suit. And I'm not sure that we're not on that track to doing that, but that's for another show. So basically, the Bank of Japan will buy every bond the government sells, and that's with the debt already at 250% of GDP, government debt, and the total debt just shy of 600%. So that the global increase in liquidity from the central banks, Charles, I did a calculation because I do a lot of work with Richard Duncan, as you know, on liquidity, and it's going to grow from 0.3% to 1.3% of global GDP. These are stunning numbers, no question. Now, you just released a couple papers this week on the subject, and I was hoping that you could distill them for us and just make some sense out of what is going on here.
Well, it's an excellent topic, Gordon, and I'm looking forward to your comments on the basic structure that we're talking about here, which is, I think, has several parts. One is Japan was one of the first post-war models of success, right? They were badly shattered, really, by the World War II, which, as everyone knows, they lost, and they had a shattered industrial sector. And so they had a post-war miracle, if you will, where they rose from the ashes, and within 20, 30 years, they'd become the second largest economy in the world. They were banking money, and there was fears in the 1980s that they would buy up most of America.
I remember. It was front page news, magazines, and all that. They were going to own, same as we hear discussion on China nowadays, right?
Right. And so so there's a model that Japan used that South Korea followed, and to some degree, I think, with communist influences, China is pursuing too. And it's a state, it's kind of a state version of capitalism, where the central states' ministries of finance and trade are hand in glove with these giant cartels to set a mercantilist policy. And what mercantilist policy means is it's export driven. In other words, let's make a lot of money by selling our surplus goods and services to the rest of the world. And then that's our road to wealth. And Japan has proven that, right, as a successful model. But now that model is failing. Japan's been stagnant for fully 25 years now. Their bubble popped at the top of 1989, and 25 years later, they're struggling, and as you say, pursuing this Keynesian cargo cult strategy of quantitative easing and huge deficits to replace the private spending that's been stagnant for decades. The government builds bridges to nowhere, essentially.
Just to interrupt there, Charles, for some of our listeners, Japan was what started quantitative easing as an experiment. They started ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, but if listeners may not be aware, they've migrated to something called QQE. So so has it been a proven success model from them? Clearly not, and yet we're following along right on that roadmap.
That's right. And Gordon, I think we want listeners to understand that what we're talking about is three subjects here. One is Japan as an individual nation with unique characteristics. Another is the whole Asian mercantilist model, which Japan has established and which all the other Asian nations are following in one way or another. And then the third topic is that this is actually, as you say, the same strategy that the West is pursuing too. It's just a slightly, they're ahead of us in some ways, and the model is slightly different, but it's the same roadmap that you and I have discussed before. So we're going to kind of mix those three different versions, three different topics. Japan, this state mercantilist model of development, and the general roadmap of quantitative easing and financial repression that's part of the model. So, you have one of my charts here, which is the budget of the Japanese government from 2005, a decade ago. And I updated the current numbers on my essay. But what we find here is tax revenues have been stagnant for this decade. They're about the same as they were 10 years ago, but they're borrowing about half of their budget is supplied by bond sales. So they're basically borrowing half of their spending, and the bond debt service is soaking up about a fourth of their entire budget. And then because they're aging, their Social Security has leaped about 10 trillion yen in the last decade to 30 trillion yen per year. So what we find is their tax revenues don't even cover debt service and Social Security. That's a stunning set of imbalances, if you will. And tax revenues, they keep trying to raise those revenues by increasing their VAT tax, right? Their excise tax.
Yeah, they're going to increase it again from 8% to 10% next year.
Right.
With consumption already falling off. And Charles, if they were to get this 2% inflation rate that they're after, bond prices will go up, which means the debt becomes more expensive. And already, as you just argued, they can't even pay what they've already incurred. So how can this end anything but in a disaster? I don't see the exit strategy here, but anyway.
Right. And so we can see why they're in they're boxed themselves in by going back to the four pillars of their success, which they're still clinging to. The integration of government ministries and private sector cartels, the heavy reliance on exports for growth, a reliance on the domestic savers to provide the capital, and of course that's a pan-Asian characteristic of the development model. Is Asian households tend to save a lot. They save 20, 30, 40, even 50% of their income. So this model relies on domestic savings to provide cheap capital. They don't have to borrow it; the savers provide it. And then the fourth pillar is, if there are defaults or write-offs of bad debt, they're hidden from view in like zombie loans and zombie banking, so that that the public perception of failure is managed, because this in the Asian culture, a loss of faith and a loss of faith, a loss of face leads to a loss of faith. And that's bad. Perception of success is really critical in Asia. So you hide all the bad stuff and all the defaults and all the zombie loans, but as a result of that, you never clear the decks. You never get rid of all the bad debt that's an overhang, and so you're basically continuing or expanding your malinvestment and misallocation of capital. And then my last point here in these four failed pillars is that Japan built up immense wealth. And so a lot of people wonder, and myself included, how have they been allowed, or how can they have stagnated for 25 years and still be standing? every other economy in the world would have already collapsed, or their currency would have collapsed. And so I think the answer is Japan built up an immense uh, amount of wealth in the 60s and 70s and 80s, which they invested a lot of it overseas. And so they're living off their seed corn, if you will. They're, you know, that's how they've been able to afford stagnation for 25 years. So the question is, how much longer will their accumulated wealth support this failed quantitative easing, borrowing to the hilt kind of mechanism of survival? And I think at some point that's the brick wall they're going to run into.
Well, I think they're there, Charles, I would argue, because their balance of trade has now went negative. It used to be, or has hovered and was negative there at one point, and will, I believe, continue to be. The demographics have shifted so significantly and are accelerating as the population's getting older, therefore not contributing as much tax, and maybe more importantly, now withdrawing from the pension plans. So this is a serious crisis pending. And why I say it's already there, Charles, is I think they're into the end game and the solution right now. And when they announced last week the Bank of Japan will now start to buy all of the debt, basically, that the government's going to produce. What was hidden to the public and not as noticeable was that the biggest pension plan in the world, which is the Japanese pension plan, a public pension plan, which is close to $1.4 trillion. It's now going to move, and it's because Shinzo Abe changed the board of directors, so it's changed the policy. It's now going to stop buying bonds, reduce them. It's going to go from a 60% bond holding down to 35%. Pensions are supposed to be bonds, right? Widows and orphans, but they're taking it down. And conversely, what they're going to do with the money is they're going to buy equities. They're going to go from 25% to 50% holding of equities, and have already started. And about 110 million of that, or billion rather, how big these numbers get, will be bought will be foreign equities. So the subtlety here, Charles, is they're debasing the yen. They're driving the yen down. But what they're trying to do is to protect the store of value of these pensioners that they're going to have to pay by having them invested in foreign assets, vis-a-vis equities that won't depreciate because they're in other currencies. This is a new twist on currency wars. You follow my logic there?
Yeah, no, I have not heard anybody
else. Brilliant.
Yeah, it's extremely important, and I'm glad you elucidated that. Because, of course, if you devalue your currency, I think they've devalued it about 30%, haven't they?
35% in the last 3 years, and it's dropping again. That's their goal. They're going to drive it down, which means the store of value is plummeting.
Right, and we might want to just take a second and explain what that does to the Japanese household, who is now paying for natural gas and oil, which is imported, and a lot of food, soybeans and stuff from the U.S. So they're paying 35% more for everything that's being imported. So what does that do to your disposable income?
Exactly. The only thing that's helping right now is that oil prices have been falling at such a rate, which is stilling the waters temporarily within the country. But Charles, this roadmap that they're on, we're following the rest of the developed countries, and it's not just quantitative easing and zero interest rate policy. It's more than that. It's a lot of the roadmap of the things that you and I have been talking about for at least a year and a half. This central planning, more and more central planning. And then with the central planning, when the governments become this large, you get people living off the governments, and we call it crony capitalism. We've talked extensively about that, and how it evolves and why it evolves and the mechanics that are behind it. But it then goes to financial repression because the government is forced to figure out a way of paying it off. And what this is all about is zero real interest rates, which is nothing more than a transfer of wealth from savers to the government, to the primary dealers, and to the leveraged borrowers in the market. And that's what it is. It's effectively a transfer. So you got financial repression, which leads to statism. And I was just looking last night at the amount of unrest that we have in Europe that's going on in specifically Brussels, but all of the changes in governments in Europe, the amount of anti-Euro sentiment that's going on there, and I could go around the world, because all these changes are causing significant social unrest. And this is something you and I predicted was coming.
That's right, Gordon. And I think the way I would characterize the points you just made is systemic risk is rising, right? We know there's no free lunch. You borrow money, you have to pay interest, even if it's only 0.5%. Japan is piling up so much debt that even interest rates that are near zero eventually cripple your other spending. And that's what Japan is showing. And I think what we have to think through too is this Keynesian cargo cult idea that if you just you can borrow your way out of trouble, and if you create inflation, then it's going to somehow save the day by reducing your interest costs. But what people forget is what Japan's also showing us is inflation takes money out of households because wages are not rising, and wages have been falling in Japan. I believe the statistic I read was they've fallen about 9% in the last decade. That's a huge hit. So how is inflation going to help a household that's already lost 10% of its purchasing power? It's only going to crunch it even more.
You know, we're being sold a bill of goods. That may be too strong, but everybody, all the countries are talking about having to get inflation up to 2%. You and I both know that inflation is actually much higher than that if it's calculated correctly. However, even the fact that they're trying to drive up inflation, to the average person out there, this is not good. It's the absolute, why is inflation positive? Unless you own assets that are appreciating, and the vast majority of people that are on earned income are not, in fact, owning assets, other than maybe that's in their pension plan if they're lucky enough to have their pensions. So, you know, a simple statement, Charles, you know, inflation, let's say inflation's 5%, and let's say you're lucky enough to get a 2% salary increase. That means that you're losing 3% per year, which 5 years, 15% minimum. It's worse than that. But that's because you're dependent on salaries in the middle class. Now, if you're the wealthy, it's not about salaries, it's about capital gains. It's about asset appreciation. So if you've got 5%, and it's much higher than that, I'm not just talking about the stock market, but those assets are going up, but you can borrow the money at 2%, and they're getting it at 0.5%, you're netting 3%, and it's much, much larger. That's a transfer of wealth. That's maybe an incorrect way of really spelling it out, but I just want people to understand why we're getting inequality. The policies are blatantly flawed, but they're in a trap, because what it is, Charles, and I was reading a paper here on financial repression, and it was a 5-year-old paper, and they referred to it as a liquidation tax. The word that disappeared after that in all the papers, but in the economic working papers, they called it a liquidation tax, and that's what this is: liquidating the debt over time.
Well, now, what has this depreciation of the yen done to the Nikkei stock exchange? It's sent it to the moon, right?
Exactly. So it's protecting those who own assets, which is the wealthy, or some of the middle class that are fortunate. Why they have to do it, for many reasons, is to drive up collateral values so that people can borrow. Because you can't borrow money unless you've got some level of collateral, never mind the margin levels that's out there, and because of the magnitude of the pensions. They've got to stop the pensions, because the next crisis, you've heard me, Charles, say that's not a banking crisis, it's a pension crisis. And therefore an insurance funding problem. And this is the way of stopping it. That's why they're trying to drive up inflation. But you know, the government can take your money 3 ways. They can do it through taxation, and everybody over 12 years old understands that one. The second one they can take it is through inflation, and people don't understand that it is a stealth tax. That's what inflation is, because it's a monetary increase of the money supply. But when you run out of runway, and you reach a point where you can't do much more, and you've hidden inflation, which we're hiding, and it's much, much higher, according to John Williams, 10%, the only thing you can do then is you have to go to negative real interest rates. And for some reason, people just can't seem to get their mind around what negative real interest rates are. And that's how you debase the value of that store of value so that the government will pay it back in future years at a much lower rate, but your taxes are a nominal basis, right? So that's how the shift happens over a period of time. Ever mind on a shorter term basis, where they're spending the money, first user gets the real value. A little long-winded, but these are the points that we should have learned from Japan, that doing this does not work. It just kicks the can down the road and buys us more time. These are structural issues, as you point out, Charles.
Right, and Gordon, you've described China to a T as well,
Exactly,
and I want to tie this in that Japan does have cultural characteristics which are unique. It's an island state, and the households save a lot, but those characteristics of the structural problems are showing up in China as well. That the domestic economy is not very efficient actually, and people are not paid a real rate of interest, so they're putting their money in the shadow banking system in China, which is, of course, the Wild West and extremely risky. So the result of financial repression that you just described is people have to take a lot higher risk to try to earn some sort of return. They put their money in a really shaky, fly-by-night financial company, which is like the shadow banking, right? They're loaning their money at 15% to some developer who, the office is closed a week later and they've lost all their money. Or in Japan, they're driven to speculate in very risky ways to try to get a return at all. So this is building up a huge amount of systemic risk, which is hidden from us.
Exactly correct. No, the whole basis of assessing risk is based on the country's treasury sovereign debt being zero risk, being riskless. So U.S. Treasury is supposed to be riskless. Do you really believe the U.S. Treasury, with the amount of debt we have, is in fact riskless? In other words, we're completely mispricing risk. But the argument that always comes back is, well, they can't default because they can print the money. That is where the risk is. The risk lies in the currency, Charles. It's not in the bond. You'll get the value. You'll get the money, but you won't get the value. It's in the currency. And that's what hyperinflation is. It's a currency event. So it's when we lose faith in that paper, that currency, that the problems really begin. And right now, we still believe that money that we're handed and is floating around actually has value, but it has no store of value. And one of the days there will be a panic. And some of these currencies. And so look at when Japan's at the level it is, with the yen falling right now, and their plan to fall even further, there's got to be the beginnings of people trying to get out of the yen in a big way, right?
Absolutely.
I didn't mean it'll be long-winded, but just these are the signs of when it's going to happen.
Right. I mean, if the Japanese households were told their yen was going to lose 30% of its value, they probably would have rushed into gold or other currencies. And that may be part of why the dollar is so strong, is people fleeing these currencies which are being debased on purpose. And Gordon, I think I want to mention one last point about the Japanese model is it's still totally export dependent.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so as the global economy slides into recession, what happens to exports from everybody? They all decline.
That's what's happening right now. Total global aggregate demand is falling. Real disposable income is falling, so it is shrinking.
And so
the rate of growth is shrinking. Okay.
That's right. And so these economies, the Asian model, is very export dependent. So as exports dry up, those economies that are most export dependent, and which also includes Germany, they're going to be the most vulnerable to crises or unexpected crises.
Concluding comments, Charles? What's the message for our listeners here today?
I think the message is, in my mind, is that Japan is the test case for both the failure of the Asian mercantilist export-dependent model, and also the model of borrowing your way out of debt as a solution. And so the fact they failed for 25 years is a huge warning to the rest of the world, which, as you say, is one way or the other is pursuing that exact same path.
Exactly. It's an oxymoron, isn't it? That the solution to your debt problem is to borrow more at an accelerating rate. Oh boy. Anyway, we got to do it, Charles. We have to do a show and talk about solutions again, as opposed to the problem. So until next month. Talk to you then.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
Talk to you. Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.